Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday evening, and welcome to the final lecture of the California Garden and Landscape History Society, CGLHS. Welcome to the final lecture of our 2021 online series. I believe that many of you have attended one or two of our other lectures over the past year, but in case not, my name is Eleanor, and I sit on the executive board of CGLHS. I work as a landscape historian. I'm based in San Francisco, and I'm here tonight to introduce our partner and tonight's presentation. I do want to start by saying that the lecture is being recorded, and it will be made available to members online after the fact. The program will extend for approximately 1 hour, with each speaker talking for between 10 and 15 minutes, and we'll try and save some time at the end for discussion if you have questions. And at that time, we'll welcome you to unmute yourself and ask a question if you prefer that, or you can go ahead and put your question in the chat, and myself and my co-host Marissa will monitor the chat and can help facilitate that conversation after the presentations. I'd also like to take this moment to encourage you to look at the California Garden and Landscape History Society's website and review our membership options if you aren't already a member. CGLHS is a membership-led organization, and members benefit from early registration to our events and discounted rates to our different programs, and they also receive mailed copies of our quarterly Eden Journal, which is a big favorite among our members. Our partner in tonight's presentation is the North American Japanese Garden Association, or NAJGA. It's like the two organizations with the most confusing acronyms are partnering up tonight to present together. NAJGA is a nonprofit organization that seeks to connect and support the Japanese garden community in North America and beyond. And we have had some international registrants to our programs before, so I'll be curious to see if anybody is registered tonight from outside the US. In a moment, I'll hand this off to my co-moderator, Marissa, who is a representative from NAJGA, who has invited 3 of their members to speak with us about 3 different gardens in California tonight, 2 in Northern California and 1 in Southern California. And a representative from each garden is going to share a little bit about their garden's design, talk about what makes their garden a Japanese garden, and hopefully discuss some issues of authenticity. So with that being said, Marissa, I'm going to hand this off to you now.
And thank you, Eleanor. It's a pleasure to be with CGLHS tonight and co-host this webinar. We're really excited to share these 3 amazing gardens with you. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Patrick Rigney. And he is from the Japanese garden, SuihoEn, in Van Nuys, California. So Patrick, as a landscape architect for the past 30 years with the city of Los Angeles, Patrick has been responsible for all the grounds care, staff training, nursery, and construction management. With his design background ranges from Hollywood stars' homes to native urban landscapes, but his real passion is his love for the Japanese garden. His interests include gardening with his family, road trips to visit museums, and to see the sights along the way, all things historical. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Patrick, so that you can share yours.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for having me today. And I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. I believe, do you see my screen right now?
Not yet.
No. Okay, so here we go. Okay. We have that yet?
We can see it now. Perfect.
Okay, fantastic. The Japanese garden actually has 2 names. Dr. Kwana gave it an American name, the Japanese garden, and also a Japanese name, the SuihoEn, which means Garden of Water and Fragrance. The garden was designed by Dr. Koichi Kwana and dedicated in 1984. A Japanese garden is many things, and each garden is unique. Visitors to a Japanese garden are often provided with stories and tales, but that's not what really makes a Japanese garden. So I'd like to focus on gardens design. Those things are brought into consideration are the culture, the nature of the Japanese people are embodied in their gardens, the forces of nature that sculpt the land, a close relationship to water, change in seasons, simplicity in detail, and the adventure of sights and sounds. These are some of the elements that Dr. Kwana designed into our garden. Entry into the garden is through a simple and unassuming trifold gate. A glimpse of the garden is seen by the opening of one panel and invites you to begin your adventure. Once inside, you see a highly stylized pine. It captures your eye, and but just for a moment as the view opens up in both directions. Now, this is not something you normally would see in a garden, but that's actually something that's happening in the garden right now. And so it's, a necessary thing in some of these gardens where you have to come in and do some major work. That garden is taking place in what was our dry garden. So that's what it looks like now. Our construction has been delayed. And so let's see where I am here. So the dry garden was made of fine crushed light gray pebbles and was gently raked at the edges of the boulders to represent a calm ocean. And that was the area that is now grassy. In the center of the picture is a sloping landform that hides a secret that we'll come to a little bit later from now. And within that garden is a simple and unassuming arrangement of stones that like an early Shinto shrine. On the right, as you enter, you begin to see a larger garden, the first of several islands in front. Behind that, you catch a glimpse of the first of several lanterns in the garden as elements begin to reveal themselves. This is the part of the garden that is the largest and is meant for strolling while relaxing and enjoying the sights and sounds. This lantern light is a split in the pathway where you have a choice to follow the water side, or the pathway destinations are hidden by the ground. The garden uses monochromatic shades of green surrounding the visitor as the pathways cut through the landscape. You can see different textures, different shades of green, different forms. The redwood trees in the background were used to stop the visitor's eye and force the view in the foreground. And monochromatic shades of gray are also used. These are seen in the use of lanterns, pebbles, stones, and gravel used in the dry garden. The use of greens and grays help bring together the site's major elements. Welcome to the Donald C. Tillman Water Reclamation Plant. This facility treats millions of gallons of water each day and returns it for reuse. And you can see here the grays of the panels, the lights, and the concrete. This is the process. 12 hours ago, this was that water. The Japanese garden is approximately 6.5 acres, 3 acres of it being water. Now remember the dry garden in Tortoise Island? That was cleverly hiding a structure that's 30 feet below ground where untreated sewage flows through pipes large enough to stand in. That pipe cuts through underground in the Japanese garden and goes to the treatment plant. So that's where our garden's name comes into effect. SuihoEn is the garden of water and fragrance. So Dr. Kwana had quite a nice little joke there. The project was envisioned by Donald C. Tillman, who was once the chief city engineer. In order to alleviate the flows downstream, they wanted to build an upstream plant. In order to do that, they had to build something to give back to the public. And in the 1969 to 70, Donald C. Tillman was taking Dr. Kwana's class at UCLA on Japanese gardens. So, after that class and many years later, in 1984, it became the Japanese garden, where we use it as an educational tool on reclamation of water. In the beginning, Dr. Kwana didn't want anybody to see the garden. One of the things about a Japanese garden is that it has to have time. It's what you do with it over time that's important. And so you can see this was about in the opening. It's pretty naked. The spaces aren't well defined. Everything is quite visible. This is just another view to show you again. At one time, we used to be able to see from the borrowed landscape of the park next door. That park is no longer visible since we're in a floodplain. And so now we have a wall there with a water garden. But at one time, the landscape was borrowed where you could see in and out. That same view today. It's quite a bit different. Everything is older, more mature. The spaces of the garden and the adventure can now be experienced. Foliage in the garden. The picture is a little bit out of focus, but it shows you the different greens and the rare occasion that we get to see a little bit of fall color in Southern California. We were just talking today about the weather being 108 degrees. So it's not much of an opportunity to see the seasons, although seasons are very important in a Japanese garden design. It's another viewpoint, Kasuga lantern with the yellow of the green of the ginkgo leaves. A pathway beckons you to adventure up and see, and eventually it is revealed. Dr. Kwana wanted you to have a viewpoint. For some reason, he especially wanted this to be a picture point. So here we have cascading black pines with the Kasuga lantern in the background. And when you're down the pathways, you see glimpses of elements. This draws you in, this creates the sense of mystery. And in a Japanese garden, you don't actually get to see the entire element until you have arrived. Cycad's obscure viewing arbor. The waterfall and bridge, sounds and the feel as you walk, the crushing sound of the pathway, the give as you walk over the bridge, the sound of moving water. These are the things that you're intended to experience as you walk through a garden. Azaleas, we don't have much of a season in Southern California, but we try to represent the 4 seasons as best we can. So a few pictures of some of the flowering plants in the garden. We have a plum tree, camellia, water lily. And this is all possible with a nursery. So because of the temperatures that we are dealing with, we're oftentimes faced with replacing plants. And over the years, nurseries were unable to supply the material and the quality that we needed. So about 15 years ago, we established a nursery on site where we grow azaleas and camellias primarily. And then also, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but we have a small redwood forest where we harvest our own rangui logs, since we are no longer able to purchase those due to the bark beetle. We grow big trees and we grow little trees. And we also have a greenhouse where we propagate and where we can grow orchids to display in public areas. So a Japanese garden is many things. It's a much more subtle type of a garden, unlike some of the styles of other gardens like English gardens or French gardens. A Japanese garden is meant to be experienced on many levels. It also takes quite a bit of time. The maintenance that's required to maintain a Japanese garden is what provides that designer's image of what the gardener had designed, what Dr. Kwana had designed. It takes some time to develop. And so I am the 3rd generation to be given that task. I've been there for 30 years, and I hope that you can have a nice visit here someday. We don't have boat rides, but we do have a beautiful garden. And I'd like to just, on behalf of Dr. Kwana, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And if you could just stop sharing your screen, I'll introduce Shozo Kagoshima, our next presenter. Shozo is the Executive Director of the Hakone Foundation in Saratoga, California. Shozo is a native Californian, born and raised in the San Jose area. He spent the first 35 years of his career at the world-famous Winchester Mystery House in San Jose. He spent the past 5 years as executive director for the Hakone Foundation, leading a team of 10 staff members in managing the historic Hakone Estate Gardens. He enjoys his office view every day because it is so tranquil and beautiful, no matter what the season is. So Shozo, I'm going to stop sharing so that you can share yours.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you, Eleanor. My name is Shozo Kagashima, and I am the Executive Director for the Hakone Foundation here in Saratoga. Unlike the other two presenters, I do not have a garden background. Mine is more business related, but I do enjoy, my only connection is being Japanese and having our own Japanese garden in the front yard. So it's something you take for granted as you're growing up. Hakone was owned by 3 private owners from 1916 to 1966. From 1916 to 1932, we call it the Stein era. 1932 to 1961 was the Tilden era, and 1961 to 1966 was the partnership era. Oliver and Isabel Stein were the first owners of the property, and they purchased 15 acres of hillside property in the Santa Cruz Mountains on the outskirts of the village of Saratoga, which is now part of the Silicon Valley. Their ambition was to build their own Japanese garden estate for use as their secondary residence. That's Oliver on the left and Isabel on the right. Oliver was a real estate developer in San Francisco, and Isabel enjoyed culture and arts. And actually, she was a member of the Japan Society in Northern California. They got their inspiration for Japanese gardens, Japanese culture by visiting the Panama Pacific Exposition in 1915. I think the Panama Pacific Exposition was very influential in the development of Japanese gardens back in that era, between San Francisco as well as San Diego. You know, I know that that's what inspired a lot of the Japanese gardens. In fact, within a mile radius of Hakone, there are 2 other gardens that were built in this time. One is still a private residence, and the other one was covered over as a parking lot for a hotel. So that is no longer there. But they were all 3 developed about the same time. In 1916, Isabel Stein traveled to Japan with her eldest son, Michael, and they toured around Japan to visit various gardens and parks so that she can get her inspiration and ideas for her own private estate. Upon returning from Japan in 1917, the Steins hired Shintani Tsunematsu, who was a noted craftsman and Japanese carpenter, and Naoharu Aihara, who was a noted landscape architect. This is the upper moon viewing house, which was completed in 1917. This is a picture of Isabel Stein standing in her gardens next to the pond. They built since it is on a hillside, they designed a hill and pond style garden. This is looking down from the hillside and onto the lower house and the pond. And if you look in the background, that is actually an orchard. Santa Clara Valley was known as the Valley of Heart's Delight back then because of its abundance of fruit orchards, and didn't become known as Silicon Valley until the 1960s. Here's a picture of the pond and the kids having a playful day in their canoe. And the trees in the background are part of that orchard, which were pear trees. And we still have a couple of the pear trees here on the property. This is the second of the 2 residences that were built here on the property. This is the lower house, which was used for sleeping quarters. Second owner was Major Charles Lee Tilden. He and his family owned it from 1932 to 1961. Charles Tilden was a financier who lived in Oakland and purchased the estate from Isabel Stein in 1932 and used it as a retreat for weekends and holidays. This is his wife, Lily, feeding the fish in the pond. You can see in the background that the trees have established themselves a little bit more. The hillside was actually covered in redwood trees at one point, but had been harvested for construction use for all the homes that were being built in the area. This is a picture of the 3 generations of the Tilden ownership. Charles on the far right, Alexine Gregory on the left, and Charles's step-grandson, Michael Gregory. This is James Sasaki. He was the gardener for the Tilden era. And when he applied for the position, he had no formal training in Japanese landscaping. But Mr. Tilden hired him with good faith. And he was the gardener for the next 28 years, with the exception of 4 years when he and his family were incarcerated in a relocation camp in Topaz, Utah. But after the war ended, the Tildens welcomed him back, and he continued to maintain the gardens for the Tildens until the property was sold in 1960. The third ownership group was the partnership era from 1961 to 1966. The partners were Joe and Clara Gresham, Eldon and Dion Gresham, Dan and June Lee, George and Marie Hall, Johnny Can, John and Mary Yu. Joe Gresham was a local developer, and Eldon was his son. He and Dan and June Lee were good friends. They owned a restaurant, a well-known restaurant up the peninsula in Palo Alto. And the other 3, George, Johnny Can also owned a famous restaurant in San Francisco called Johnny Can's. And John and Mary Yu were all in the restaurant business as well. George and John had a company that manufactured soy sauce, and they actually they invented the Lazy Susan that you see in Chinese restaurants today. The partnership group used Hakone as a retreat as well. They all lived within the area, but they lived busy lives. And so they wanted to use it as a place to get away. Same thing with the Steins, living in San Francisco and being in the hustle and bustle. Nothing compared to what it is today, but it's still a retreat that they can get away to a nice quiet oasis to use as a retreat. Here you can see George and Marie Hall and Joe Gresham, Dan Lee and June Lee and Eldon Gresham standing in front of the lower house. This is Charlie Ray, who was the gardener during the partnership era. In 1966, the partnership group felt that they could no longer maintain the gardens to the stature that a Japanese garden should. And they didn't want to sell the property to a developer who would then tear it down and develop homes or other buildings on the property. So they approached the city of Saratoga and asked them if they would be interested in purchasing the gardens. And under the leadership of Bill Glennon, who was on the left, the far right on the picture on the left, who was then mayor of the city, persuaded the council to take the offer, and they purchased the gardens from the partnership group. And then the garden was finally opened to the public and has become the crown jewel of the city's parks. When the city purchased the property, they hired Kanso Ishihara, who was the first gardener, and he was employed from 1966 to 1980. And he was hired specifically by the city of Saratoga to maintain Hakone Estate Gardens. He was a trained gardener trained in Japanese landscaping and design in Kyoto. After Ishihara's tragic passing in 1980, the city assigned Jack Tomlinson, who was on the city's park staff, to maintain the gardens. And Tomlinson was Hakone's gardener from 1980 to 2008. In 2008, the foundation hired Jacob Pellner as the head of garden maintenance, and he's still here today. The city found that, again, they too could not maintain the gardens to the level Japanese gardens should be maintained. And so what they did was they created a nonprofit foundation in 1980. And between 1966 and 1980, the city maintained and managed the gardens. But after the untimely death of Ishihara, the foundation was created take over the maintenance and management of the gardens. Lease agreement was written up between the City of Saratoga and the Hakone Foundation, where the foundation would take over the management, operation, and maintenance of the gardens. The mission for the foundation is to dedicate to conserve and enhance the Hakone Estate Gardens for the enjoyment and benefit of the public, and to preserve its Japanese authenticity for future generations, and to promote a deeper understanding of Asian cultures, and to serve as a global forum for art, music, culture, and ideas. Now, what we try to do is we try to maintain the garden and preserve it as Isabel Stein had originally planned and dreamed of. And we do our best to do that, but the garden is a living natural organism. So things change, plants die, and sometimes materials aren't available, so we have to change things up. So we can't always keep it exactly the same way that Isabel Stein did. But that's life. Part of our mission is to have cultural events so that people can enjoy the gardens and put two and two together and understand the relationship between culture and the garden. We do have multicultural events such as the Lunar New Year. We celebrate Hina Matsuri, which is Girls' Day. Have our Hakone Matsuri. We also do Tanabata, which is the Star Festival. And also we have Karamatsu workshops for New Year's, so that members can come in and build their own karamatsu, which is bamboo decorations you see at entrances of residences and businesses to welcome in the new year and to welcome in the spirits. One of our more popular events that's tied to Japan is Hanami, which is the flower viewing. And every spring, the cherry blossoms. For the past 4 years, we lit up the cherry trees and opened up the gardens to the public in the evenings. It's become a very popular event for us, so much so that our attendance in the month of April just skyrockets because of the cherry blossoms. Color is another thing that attracts the people. It's the beauty. The wintertime, spring, obviously, with the blooming of the cherry blossoms and the maple, leafing of the maple trees. Summertime's the different shades of green. And in the fall, we do have fall colors for a few days, right around Thanksgiving, where everything starts to turn yellow and orange, and is another natural attraction for our visitors. What are the plans for the future? As I mentioned earlier, things do change. In 2014, the city and the foundation hired the Portico Group to develop a master plan that would help Hakone move into the future. And after much input from the community, foundation board of trustees and staff, city staff, a master plan was drafted and approved by the city and the foundation in 2017. The mission of the master plan is to sustain the living and evolving spirit of the gardens and nourishing understanding across time and cultures. The goals of the master plan will be to connect with the community, restore the legacy of the gardens, buildings, and structures to make this the best Japanese garden outside of Japan. You gotta think big. Expand interpretive and educational opportunities, enhance the visitor entry and arrival sequence, make it a little bit more visitor friendly, provide adequate space for staff, improve visitor services and amenities, and to create a sustainable organization. Master plan has a 4-phase plan. Phase 1 is to renovate the pond. Phase 2 is the renovation, restoration of the existing buildings. Phase 3 is improving our visitor amenities, which is the new restrooms, gift shop, tea house, and new gardens. Phase 4 is accessibility issues of the parking lot and the addition of a new garden maintenance facilities. This is the artist rendition of the new entrance area looking west. It'll hide the gardens so that you won't see it until you actually enter the gardens. one of the main differences between Hakone and any other Japanese garden is that when you enter a Japanese garden, you view it from the bottom up. But Mrs. Stein wanted the ability to be able to sit on at the upper house and look down and enjoy the beauty of the gardens from up there. So it's a little bit different viewpoint. Post-pandemic revival, it's been a difficult 15 months and things are looking good. And as I said, the attendance for the first 5 months of 2021 has surpassed 2019's annual attendance. So we do have a strong footing financially. We were able to open up 6 weeks after the pandemic started, so that really helped us. Financially, we were able to grow our cash reserves back to pre-COVID levels thanks to higher admissions, revenue, grants, and increased donation from the community. The community really stood up and helped support so that the gardens can continue to be maintained and opened. And as of yesterday, for those of us in California, all the restrictions have been lifted, so now we're business as usual. No more mask wearing, no more social distancing. Though one of the things we instituted during the pandemic was a one-way path to ensure people didn't cross paths and contamination. And we found that actually helped guests see all of the gardens. And whereas in the past, they would kind of take shortcuts and wouldn't take the paths up to the top of the hill to the second tea garden. And they would just kind of stick around the pond area. So we noticed that there have been a lot less complaints. So we're thinking of keeping up that one-way path even after the pandemic. Part of our revenue, largest part of our revenue actually comes from holding weddings, receptions, and business meetings because of the venue and the beauty of the gardens. Pre-COVID, 60% of our total revenue was generated by private events. So you can see that we did take a big hit for the last 15 months. And even though our attendance was up, it didn't quite make up for the 60% loss in revenue. But now that we're reopened, we can put our focus back on making our master plan come to life. The big supporters of the foundation are our board of trustees. They're all volunteers and they all step up when we need their help. And then our staff, we have a very small staff, full and part-time staff. The garden itself is a total of 18 acres. We have a total of 2.5 full-time equivalent gardeners and 2 volunteers. So it's a lot of work, and but they managed to stay on top of it and do a good job. That's kind of Hakone in a nutshell, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shozo. So our final presenter tonight is Stephen Pitsenbarger from the Japanese Tea Garden in San Francisco. Stephen has been a gardener at the Japanese Tea Garden since 2007 and enjoys studying the garden's rich history. He is a NAJGA board member and has been a contributor to the NAJGA Journal and a presenter at NAJGA's conferences. He has also spent many years performing as a musician and is an avid runner who completed the Boston Marathon in 2015. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Marissa. And thank you to the California Garden and Landscape History Society for hosting this event. So the Japanese Tea Garden in San Francisco, California, is the oldest public Japanese garden in North America. We were built for a World's Fair that happened in 1894. And now we have become a very highly visited space. We get about 600,000 people a year pre-COVID. We're back up to 60 to 70% of those numbers now. And we kind of expect them to jump as the restrictions have been loosened. But one of the things that has sort of changed our mindset in regard to COVID is prior to COVID, we would be so busy because we're only about 3.5 acres. With 600,000 people a year, sometimes we would have 400 or 500 people in the garden at one time. And so COVID has sort of made us rethink the experience of being in the garden. And when we started to open back up, we opened up slowly and we limited the numbers of people that could be in the garden at any one time. And we're thinking about continuing that. So just as Shozo said, that they were continuing perhaps some of the one-way pathways and changing the way that they view the garden experience a little bit. We're doing the same thing here in San Francisco. So as I said, we were built for a World's Fair that happened in 1894. It was the California Midwinter International Exposition. And that fair had lots of exotic exhibits. There was a Hawaiian village, there was an Eskimo village, and of course there was a Japanese village. So we started as the Japanese Village and Tea Garden. Now the name Tea Garden is sort of a misnomer in the sense that we are not a tea garden. We don't even have a tea garden within the garden. We have a sencha tea house, which is more of a commercial tea house space, but we don't have a matcha tea house and a roji associated with that. And so the name Japanese Tea Garden is one of those phrases that sort of Americans and people in Europe as well, I think, latched onto that naming convention. And because we are still around 120 plus years later, we still maintain that name. So the man that was responsible for building the Japanese Tea Garden, George Turner Marsh. And George Turner Marsh was the man that had the original concession to build the garden. Marsh was, his family was from Australia. He'd grown up there in Australia. And he lived in Japan as a teenager from the time that he was 15 to about 19. And then he eventually made his way to San Francisco, where he opened a store selling Japanese art in 1876. And he was the one that landed the concession for the fair, and he financed and directed all of the details of building the garden. Marsh was an interesting character in that he not only was very invested and interested in Japanese culture, language, art, but he also was a major player in the passenger pigeon clubs in North America, or specifically in San Francisco. But he also built gardens in Monterey, in Santa Barbara, in Pasadena, and in Coronado, and all the way down to Ensenada. And there are elements of his Pasadena garden that still exist today in the Huntington Japanese garden. So the garden started small. It was about an acre in size, and it was very busy. It had a lot of structures. There was a theater, there was a restaurant, there were 2 tea houses, there was a bazaar where Marsh could sell his art goods, and there was a demonstration home. There were a lot of things happening there. It was really an exhibit to show people what a Japanese village might look like in Japan. And within that, of course, was a pond and a garden. Once the fair ended, San Francisco decided it wanted to keep the garden as a permanent feature of Golden Gate Park. And so the fairgrounds were converted into more of a permanent garden space. The theater and some of the other buildings were removed, and it was simplified a little. And the man that was in charge at that point was Makoto Hagiwara. Hagiwara was initially hired by George Turner Marsh as a caretaker of the garden. Marsh sold his concession to the city of San Francisco for $4,500 back in 1894. And he had hired Hagiwara to stay on the grounds even after he sold it to watch the place, because even back in 1894, people would hop the fence and vandalize the space. So Makoto expanded the garden and probably more than doubled it in size. It was about an acre to start with, and he made it more than 2 acres, adding ponds and adding structures, adding features. And he maintained that garden until he passed away in 1925. And then his children and his grandchildren maintained the garden all the way up until 1942. And then, just like James Sasaki down at Hakone, they were sent to Topaz near Delta, Utah during the war, just like 120,000 other Japanese on the West Coast. And so that ended the Hagiwara's tenure in the garden. There was a time after the war where the Hagiwaras tried to renegotiate a return to the garden, but the city made the terms so steep that it was kind of impossible for them to maintain that space again. And so since 1942, the garden has been maintained by gardeners who work for the city of San Francisco, like myself. So today the garden is 3.5 acres. Many of the expansions that have happened in the garden have happened since the Hagiwara family is gone. And this is true of a lot of the plants and other features in the garden. Things evolve, things change, but we still have ties to our 1894 roots and some of the things that you're looking at today, like this beautiful Monterey pine when you walk in the front gate, that was planted in that location in 1898. And so it hasn't moved. It's certainly changed, it's grown and developed more character, but it's the same tree. We have a tea house. We just have one tea house since 1942. There's only one tea house instead of two, but you can get Japanese teas in the tea house and light snacks as well, and enjoy views of the garden from that vantage. And the building that had been a demonstration home up until 1942 then became the gift shop. And so now we have Carol Murata is running the concession that runs the tea house and the gift shop. And she does a beautiful job in integrating her business with how the garden flows. And they feel very connected at this point. So we do have seasons. I know San Francisco is not known for its fall color, but just like in Hakone, around Thanksgiving is the best time for fall color, and our maples and our ginkgos can be stunning at that time of year. Spring is also a beautiful time to visit the garden. Our azaleas get to be overwhelming just inside the front entrance, and we have a number of cherry trees around the garden that bloom profusely. But really, any time of year is a good time to come and visit the garden. This is a newer addition, and I say newer in relation to the rest of the garden. This dry garden, the Karisansui, was installed in 1953 with a design by Nagao Sakurai. Sakurai, you may be familiar with if you're garden historians, because he designed the Japanese garden in Central Park in San Mateo, as well as many public and private gardens up and down the West Coast. We are in the middle of some renovations ourselves. Our pagoda looks like it's a giant rocket ship right now, ready to be launched. We're hoping to finish the pagoda restoration and take down the scaffold by this fall. The pagoda came from the 1915 Pan Am Expo and has been in the garden for more than 100 years. It was originally built as a temporary indoor structure at that fair, and it got moved outside in 1916, came over to our garden. And it's still standing, and at this point is being completely restored to its original glory, maybe even better. Hopefully it will stand for another 100 years. In addition to the pagoda, we have, we're going to rebuild a long wooden bridge that connects to the pagoda area, and we are working on finalizing a design with Hoichi Kurisu to reimagine the landscape around the pagoda. And so we're looking to have lots of sort of exciting and welcoming features in the garden in the next year or so. Thank you, and I guess we'll go to question and answers now.
Yes, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Shozo and Patrick, for sharing your beautiful gardens with us. I will now turn things over to Eleanor to start Q&A.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to all of the presenters. I definitely noticed some common threads among all three gardens, but some distinctions as well. So I'm hoping that we can get into that a little bit. You know, what makes each garden distinct, if we have time. I also have some of my own questions, but I'm going to try and prioritize those in the chat from the registrants first. So there was a question for the Hakone Garden about your master planning process. And the question is, what is the single biggest challenge or obstacle to pursuit of your master plan? And I think that's a really good question that we could extend to all three gardens. You know, what's one of the major kind of obstacles towards achieving your goals? What is the one factor that you feel could benefit you, that you have had trouble achieving?
Well, we just started the master plan, actual construction part of it. And I guess the single biggest thing is going to be fundraising. The total 4-phase project is going to be, was estimated to be approximately $40 million. The first phase of the pond renovation, reconstruction, that's going to be about $2 million. And so we actually broke that into smaller phases as well. And we started the first phase by building a new pond life support system building with filtration system through money that we got from grants from the city as well as the county of Santa Clara. And so with that, we were able to build the new filtration system. But the next phase of it will be the construction of reconstruction of the pond, and that's going to be about $2 million. And so we need to start doing a fundraising campaign, capital campaign focused on that. We broke it down into 2 parts, but we're going to fundraise so that we can try to raise all of it at one time, so that we can continue from one phase to the next. So, you know, and then going on from there, phase 2 is going to be about a $2 or $3 million project for the restoration, renovation work of the buildings. And then the most expensive part is going to be the new guest amenities, visitor areas, because of the new construction, total new construction. And so that's going to be, I believe, about a $10 million project. So, you know, capital, we live in the middle of Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of millionaires. I think the average income is $1 million, but trying to find the right people who would be willing to donate for a garden renovation, restoration, we need to find the right message.
Yeah, I would say that's the same challenge for us here in San Francisco, is the fundraising part. Japanese Gardens, are the same as you showed though in Hakone, in that we want to be the best. We want to be the best that we could possibly be. And if you want nice things cost lots of money. And so whether it's the boulders or just the design and the proper construction, those things are always expensive. And projects often take a long time to get everything lined up. And so that $10 million project today, you know, in 5 years might be a $15 million project. So it's always a challenge to try to get the energy from the community into the project in the form of money and support, other forms of support. But it's also, you're sort of racing against time because you want to get it done, you know, before we are all retired and gone.
Patrick, do you have anything to add to that? I have a hunch that your biggest obstacle is also fundraising, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, it absolutely is. You know, many years ago, we tried to build a pavilion, and we're still trying. So since, you know, 38 years, we've been trying to build a building, and it was told to us very early on that, see, we're owned by the city of Los Angeles, and we're managed by LA San. And LA San has been very good, and the city of Los Angeles has been very good at supplying us with funding to maintain what we have and giving us whatever resources we need. However, building something new is a little different. You know, nobody wants to give money to the city. And so it's very difficult to, you know, ask for money. And we don't have the ability to have the nonprofit. We attempted it at one time, and it was difficult to get off the ground. So, you know, funding for maintenance is not such a problem. Doing things more with the garden is always been a problem.
Well,
I have to say, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm totally jealous of your nursery. Maybe that can be a future capital project for us. I want to have that.
You know, we all need that. It was so many years ago, my boss and I, we lost a tree. We lost the only Aleppo pine that we have in our garden. And he and I went back and forth for 7 years trying to figure out, well, I don't like that tree. That tree's too much money, you know, these things. And so the same thing started happening with azaleas and camellias. Vendors started sending me material that was, you know, that's not the color, that's not the variety, and the quality was really poor. So we started that nursery industry in an effort to try and resolve that problem. And unfortunately, we've been pretty successful at it. Recently, we had to start growing redwood trees because of the bark beetle. You're not allowed to ship bark, with on the trees anymore from Northern California. So that's an experiment that is a 7 to 10 year estimated project.
So you don't have you don't collaborate with the Botanical Garden Nursery, Stephen, in San Francisco?
We've actually just realigned as far as how the garden is handled administratively. So we are now more closely aligned with the Botanical Garden and the Conservatory of Flowers. And so we probably will be collaborating with them, and they're in the process of building a new nursery over there. That was like a 20-year process for them to get all the planning and the money aligned, and they're ready to break ground. They're just in the last bits of the approval process, and so they're going to have a new nursery. So yeah, I'm sure we'll be collaborating going forward.
Well, on a bit of a happier note than fundraising, there was one question from Caroline asking what each presenter's favorite component of their garden was. And I think that can tie into another question here from Janet about, what are the elements of these gardens that make them Japanese in California? And is that different than a Japanese garden you might find in Japan? Why don't I start with Shozo, if you would be so kind.
Sure. I think, one of it's the peacefulness and tranquility. And when you step foot onto the property, I know every morning when I come to work, I hear the birds chirping, and, I can hear the wind blowing. And that's one of the reasons why the Steins wanted to build their own Japanese garden, is they like the beauty and simplicity, and being here in the hillside, you're away from the hustle and bustle, except for today on weekends where you hear motorcycles going up the highway here. But you step on the property, and you see the colors throughout the year, and it's just really something different from what you see down on the valley too. And I think that's the beauty that the owners saw, the 3 different ownership groups. It was a place to get away and relax and enjoy themselves. And so that's really the part of it, the simplicity of the Japanese garden. They all valued something, and that's one of the reasons why we've been so busy during the pandemic, is people wanted to go out and enjoy nature and enjoy the surroundings of the outdoors.
Do you have any thoughts on what makes a Japanese garden an authentic Japanese garden, especially one that's located in California?
Well, other than the fact that, Mrs. Stein, that's why she traveled to Japan. Back in 1916, it wasn't getting on a jet plane and getting there in 10 hours. This was on a slow boat crossing the Pacific. So it was a commitment. So she wanted to make sure when she came back and had her designs for her Japanese garden, that she was able to pick and choose the different aspects of the Japanese gardens in Japan. And that's actually where the name Hakone came from, because one of the parks that she visited was Fuji Hakone National Park. And she particularly liked the gardens there. And that's why she named it Hakone herself.
Any other thoughts on that question?
If I could chime in,
Please.
Japanese gardens are very much of their space. So on some levels, if you take a garden outside of Japan, it's no longer a Japanese garden. It's a Japanese style garden. And the function of a Japanese garden, or the reason that people build Japanese gardens, is you're taking something in nature, some special place that makes you feel connected to nature. And you're taking that feeling and you're bringing it often into an urban setting and maybe reducing it in size. And back to the earlier question of what is the favorite part of our own gardens that sort of triggers that, I feel like our dry garden, our Karasansui, designed by Sakurai, is one of those spaces that takes me to like being in the redwoods, in a redwood forest that has that sort of cathedral-like feeling, having that sort of serene moment where you don't feel like you're in the city anymore. I think that's the part of our garden that does that best. We've often within NAJGA had these discussions about authenticity. And it's sort of a loaded question. It's the question that you don't get so much with other styles of gardens, but you get that with Japanese gardens. And I think to be authentic to the intent of a Japanese garden is to try to capture the feeling that you have when you're in a Japanese garden. And that can be many different things. It can be the stone arrangements, it can be the shades of green, it can be the pathwork, the fences. All of those go into creating that feeling where you really are able to kind of forget what's going on in your life, even just for a moment, and be distracted by nature and kind of get out of your head and just be in the moment.
Definitely an interesting, very interesting question and discussion. Patrick, do you want to add anything?
Your site really dictates everything. I think I heard both of my speakers talk about that, and that's just true with everything, your site and what kind of program you're working with. You can certainly take an element from Japan, and as long as you're constructing it properly with the right joinery and putting the stonework together and understanding that boulders actually have a front, a back, a bottom, a top, and knowing how to arrange things so that they're pleasing, so that that's what makes a Japanese garden. And every garden is unique. You cannot rubber stamp a Japanese garden for those reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. In NAJGA, we always talk about, a garden in California is going to be very different from a garden in New York, for example, or in Japan. They're all very connected to their location.
Thank you, everyone, for trying to answer that complicated question. I'm taking notes, so I think they're very good answers. There is one other question in the chat, and it's from Justin. So Justin, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question if you'd like. Otherwise, I can just read it out. And while you're considering that, it's 7 o'clock. So I will take note of that, and I can stick around for a couple more minutes as we close out. I'm happy to do that. But if people need to start logging off, just wanted to raise that flag. Hi, Justin.
Hi. I went ahead and unmuted myself. So, I think actually the garden representatives already answered that question particularly in terms of boulder placement. But my main question is, will the educational programs that's talked about with any of the gardens also include elements, particularly the philosophies and other craft involved over how the design of a Japanese garden is laid out exactly? I get that would be my question, since I will admit being curious over the subject.
I hope you don't mind, Marissa, that I'm going to give a plug for the conference that we're holding in the fall in November. From November 3rd to 7th, we're going to have a conference down in San Diego, 3 days of lecture and then a couple of days of tours. And a lot of that discussion is going to be about garden designs, what makes a Japanese garden, how to implement a Japanese garden. And included in that will be some hands-on workshops. So if you're interested in making your way to San Diego in November, that's a great opportunity to learn more.
Martin, two questions. One, what is the name of this event? And two, is it open to the general public, or is this for a limited audience?
It is open to the general public. It's November 3rd through 7th. It's at the Japanese Friendship Garden in San Diego. And it's our conference hosted by NAJGA. And what's our official title, Marissa?
It is Adaptability and Sustainability in Japanese Gardens. So yeah, we're very excited. We'll actually be opening registration in about a month. So I can share that information with everyone who's participating today if you're interested. But as Steven said, it'll be in San Diego in November. For those of you that are joining us from other parts of the country, it's a great time to come to San Diego. We have great weather, but lots of content as well to learn more about Japanese gardens and connect with others in the Japanese garden community.
Admittedly, I don't know if I could, with my schedule, I don't know if I could stay all four days, but I genuinely appreciate this. And if you go ahead and send me a link, I could definitely see if I could stop by I'm hoping like 2 days of that. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Marissa, is there a link that you can just drop in the chat now?
So we don't have registration open yet,
Okay.
but I can share it with
At
the
least your
group.
website,
Mhm.
maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Dawn, I see you turned your camera on. Did you want to ask a question? Dawn, you're muted.
We are.
Oh, perfect.
Actually, I was just, Stephen beat me to the shameless plug for NAJGA. If you have any interest in things involving Japanese gardens, I would urge you to look at the NAJGA website, najga.org. There's a lot of information there. And by the way, since historians seem to be highly represented here, one of NAJGA's founders is an architectural and garden historian. And there'd be a lot of interesting discussions at the seminar, I'm sure, with Ken Brown is the gentleman's name. He knows everything there is to know about almost every Japanese garden in the US. And Southern California has a wealth of Japanese gardens. You guys are in a great place for Japanese gardens.
Well, thank you for that. And we do have a big presence in San Diego in our membership. So we'll be sure and help get the word out once registration is opened.
There will be virtual components to that conference as well. We'll have the in-person version, but if people can't make it to San Diego, most of the lectures and some of the hands-on workshops are going to be available electronically as well.
You know, I just realizing now that I missed a question in the chat, and I do think it's an interesting question. So if I hopefully it's a sort of a simple one to answer, but Michael was asking if you have arborists on staff, dedicated arborists for your garden.
I know in San Francisco that we are sort of more in the Japanese model in that the gardeners that we have on staff do everything. I think the same is probably true in Hakone. There are probably gardens, especially city run gardens, that have things split out by classification for different types of tasks. But for the most part, all of the work from picking up the trash to pruning the pines happens with the gardeners that are there at the garden.
Yeah, for Hakone, it's pretty much the same, you know, as far as the maintenance, you know, Jacob and his staff take care of that. But we do, since we are part of the city parks, we have problems with our big trees, like, you know, we're losing some of our big oaks. Then we work through the city, who then, you know, they have their own arborists who come out and evaluate the condition of the trees and make a determination of what needs to be done. So, you know, there's a working relationship between Hakone and the city itself.
And Patrick, do you have an arborist maintain your redwood forest, or is your answer similar?
Well, you know, the Japanese garden has had a personal services contract for 38 years. It's gone from different people to different contractors over the years. And some of my staff went from 3 different contracts and have 40 years or so of combined experience. We have the ability to bring arborists in, horticulturalists, aquatics experts. A lot of times I'm wearing that hat. And so we don't generally have that, but we have the ability to bring those in.
Thank you. That was a good question. I was curious about that too. So it's 7:06. I think I'll go ahead and wind this down. But I want to thank all 3 speakers again so much for helping provide this program to our membership. And I also just want to, you know, once more thank NAJGA for partnering with us on this. It's been a really fun time getting to know Marissa a little bit and getting to know more about your organization. And I know I'll definitely be checking out the conference program in the fall. It sounds like a really good opportunity to get some of my own questions answered that I didn't have a chance to dive into tonight. And Stephen, maybe I'll see you around the San Francisco Botanical Garden. I live just 2 blocks away, so.
Come visit us. We're open every day.
I know, I see the lines. You guys are busy.
Yeah, we are.
Yes, no, thank you, Eleanor. It was great to partner with you. And thank you to Stephen, Shozo, and Patrick for sharing your gardens with us. We really, you know, appreciate the opportunity to showcase these gardens, and hope that we'll have other opportunities to partner with our organizations and showcase more about our important California gardens.
Agreed. Thank you so much.